We are now in the midst of a war, not for vengeance, but for a world safe for our children. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1940. Roosevelt said that very shortly after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into World War II. Prior to this, the United States was neutral, although we favored trade with the Allies. World War II ended up helping the United States out of the Great Depression with the production of more war-related materials and creating new jobs for people. So what we'll be doing today is looking at the perspective of the United States and the Japanese throughout the war and how the war is remembered by both sides.
So the first assignment you guys had this week was just the focus on Japan at the beginning of the war and throughout the war, and how the United States and Japan reacted to issues during the war. So we started off with a little introduction to the war itself. The United States began with George Washington's idea of following a policy of neutrality and isolationism, not getting involved in other people's affairs, especially those in Europe. Although with the attack on Pearl Harbor, obviously that changed. So one of the things that you guys looked at this week was this film which comes from the movie Pearl Harbor, which was made early 2000s. So you just had to tell me how the film portrays Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And basically it really just shows that the United States is surprised by the attack. We had no idea it was coming. At least that's how the video portrays it. I know there's conspiracy theories out there and everything. And Japan is very deliberate and decisive and strategic in their attack on America and our naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So then you guys had to read an article titled, "Why Does America Remember Pearl Harbor?" And according to the article on the West Point website, why do you think Americans memorialize Pearl Harbor every year? What does this historical event mean to our nation? And basically, obviously we have to remember it because we need to appreciate the sacrifices that people made who were serving at Pearl Harbor when they were attacked. But it also shows the United States kind of awakening. Some people term it as awakening the sleeping giant, and showing how the United States, basically our involvement in the war turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. Now, nobody knew it at the time, but by awakening this so-called sleeping giant, the United States industrial power, the United States, along with our allies, Great Britain, France, Russia, other countries, obviously, Canada's in there, Australia, we are able to defeat the Axis powers and show kind of this triumph of free nations over dictatorships. And that kind of goes back to the quote I had in the very beginning, a world safe for our children. That's also a calling back to Woodrow Wilson's declaration of war and making the world safe for democracy during World War I. So this theme of the United States kind of getting involved in the issues in order to make the world a better place is definitely prevalent throughout each war that we're involved in, and Pearl Harbor really gives the United States that idea. The actual movie, Pearl Harbor, I was not a really big fan of. I thought it was too romantic-y and not enough history, which, I don't know if you've seen it. You can argue with me on that if you want to, but it does do a decent job of portraying the war itself. The next steps were the Japanese internment camps, and you guys in lesson 2 did a whole lesson on that, on what the reasoning behind them was. And so the question I asked you here was how the reporter kind of portrays the camps to the Japanese Americans and U.S. citizens. And they're definitely using very positive language. When you listen to it, you hear words like wholeheartedly and loyal, sacrificial, opportunity. All these things that are making it seem like, oh, look at these Japanese Americans. They're really helping our country. And even the picture that we see over here, shows the Japanese smiling, cheering, saying, oh, they're really helping the war effort by relocating themselves. Whether that was the case or not is obviously another issue. So the news reporter is showing some bias here and kind of giving the pro side of the internment camps. As the war progresses, the United States uses a policy of island hopping, which I'm sure you guys remember from either last year or 8th grade. I used to make my students jump from place to place for island hopping. They certainly loved that, not really, but to kind of demonstrate how the United States got closer and closer to Japan. You'll recall from either 9th or 10th grade that part of Japanese culture was just never to surrender. So as the war progresses, people keep dying on both sides, and Japan is refusing to surrender. So after FDR passes away and the presidency is given to Harry Truman, Roosevelt's vice president, he finds out about the Manhattan Project. He didn't even know about it. That's how secretive it was. And he makes the ultimate decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. He wanted Japan to surrender, but he knew, based on the actions of the Japanese, that they probably were going to refuse to do so. So finally, in August, the United States, using our resources made with the Manhattan Project, the atomic bombs, dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, whatever you want to say, and Japan still did not surrender. So a couple days later, the United States dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which officially forced Japan into surrendering, therefore ending World War II. You'll recall the war in Europe ended a few months prior to this. Then you guys had to read an article titled Exhibiting World War II in Japan and the United States. It was based on museums, which I thought was an interesting perspective, because usually we're like, oh, museums, there's no bias there. But clearly there is. So as you were reading that article, you would have seen that there's different types of museums out there. So the article talks about how different members of Japan society argue over how to remember World War II, especially the atomic bomb. And then you had to look at two of those arguments. There's arguments over how to portray Japan's involvement. Do they make himself look like a good guy, bad guy, both? We're not sure. Should they use a military national identity, kind of how the United States has been doing? Or should they continue using peaceful memorials? Number 2 asked, do you think the initial exhibit of the Enola Gay done by the National Air and Space Museum was anti-American? And why might World War II veterans have this feeling? That is up to you if you feel it's anti-American. The veterans from World War II, they're known as the Greatest Generation. They could possibly see it as anti-American because they're not focused, the exhibit was not really focused on all the death and destruction that led to the decision to drop the atomic bomb, because Truman really just wanted to save lives. He wanted to save American lives. And that's why he decided to drop it, because had he not, thousands more Americans would have died trying to attack the mainland of Japan. So veterans are upset that rather than focusing on this, their focus was more on the effects in Japan of the atomic bombs, and they didn't really find that fair to them. So that's up to you how you interpret that argument. Number 3, how do groups in Japan try to promote peace when creating exhibits? There's several peace museums, and they have a very clear anti-nuclear weapons message that shows the suffering of the victims of the atomic bombs, which you guys saw in Lesson 3. Very disturbing stuff, and trying to end nuclear weapons altogether, which is interesting, especially coming after the Cold War, where the whole arms race was based on getting to the most nuclear weapons. The Peace Osaka Museum in Japan has institutionalized collective remembrance that's built around testimony of local suffering due to policies of both the United States and Japanese governments. So how does that promote the message of never again? And this idea of never again is very prevalent, especially when you're talking about the Holocaust. But basically, this museum really just wants to say, hey, war is not the answer. It should be avoided at all costs. This was not just Japan's fault, it's the U.S. fault as well. Both sides have committed atrocities. This is not the way to go. And then the end of the article talks about strategies for managing controversy among museums in the United States and Japan. You had to choose one and argue whether you believe it's helpful or harmful in learning the history of World War II. So one strategy was to limit the war-related exhibits to non-controversial topics, basically focusing on like the home front and promoting that national identity where you're proud of your country. You can blame the governments, either the Japanese or American governments, or you can create an exhibit to console survivors. So that was up to you to decide, if that's a helpful or harmful way to learn the history of World War II. Now, based on what we've learned so far, I've given you guys a Hollywood movie, the news reporter's idea of internment camps, a very informational Times video, all right, and how the museums think about World War II. So you can use all that information when you create your Flipgrid video that tells us how Japan and the United States remember the war.